Well, hello, everyone. I am Michael Hinkson, and you are listening to Unstoppable Mindset. Our guest today is Michael Bervell, who is a Ghanaian-American angel investor. He is a published author, and he is also an entrepreneur and a scholar by any standards. And if he wants to brag about all that and all the different kinds of accolades and awards he's gotten, he's welcome to do that. And I will just take a nap. No, I won't. I won't take a nap. I'll listen to him. I've read it all, but I'll listen to it again. Michael, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a great name you have too, both the podcast and your own name. Another Michael.
I think it's a great name.
Yeah.
People have asked me why I say Michael and do I prefer Michael to Mike. And as I tell people, it took a master's degree in 10 years, a master's degree in physics in 10 years to figure this out. But I used to always say Mike Hinkson on the phone, and people always said Mr. Kingston. And I couldn't figure out why are they saying Kingston when it's Hinkson? And I introduced myself as Mike Hinkson. And finally, one day it hit me in the head. They're getting the Mike, the K part with the Hinkson, and they're calling it Kingston. If I start saying Michael Hinkson, will that change it? I started saying Michael Hinkson, and immediately everybody got it right. They said Mr. Hinkson or Michael or whatever. I don't really care. Mike or Michael is fine, but the last name is Hinkson. So there.
It's so funny. Yeah, I'm glad no one's calling you Mr. Linkson or something, like taking
Yeah,
the L and adding it to.
they do. They do sometimes do Hingston, which isn't right,
Yeah, yeah,
which shows you sometimes how well people listen. But, what do you do?
exactly.
What, tell us a little bit, if you would, about the early Michael Bervell growing up and where and all that sort of stuff, and then we can get into all sorts of fun stuff because I know you've been very interested in accessibility and disabilities and all that. We'll get to that, but tell me about you
Yeah,
growing up.
yeah. I mean, for me, home for me was in Seattle, and I actually lived and went to school in a place that was about 30 minutes apart. So my parents would drop me off at school in the morning. I'll go through the day, meet all my friends, and then come back home. They would pick me up, take me back home in the evening. So I had a lot of time in the day after school. School ends at 2, and my parents pick me up at 5 to do all this other stuff. So I would
Yeah,
always fill up my day. So I used to always be part of every student club. I did every sports team. I was in high school, on the captain of all these teams and such. Um, and of course, I would go home and my parents picked me up. And in that in between time, I spent a lot of time in the library. So I
mm.
probably, for every day in middle and high school, spent 3 hours a day at the library, just in that in between time before
Waiting for your
actually
parents.
waiting for my parents. So that for me was a lot of time that I just used to incubate projects. I taught myself how to code and took some CS classes when I was, in high school at the library. I became friends with all the librarians and joined the student library advisory board when I was in 8th grade at the library, and did a bunch of other things. But I think probably the most impactful library project that I had was actually a nonprofit that my family and I started. And it was in memory of my grandmother who, born in Ghana, she used to always go back there in the winter times because, it's cold in Seattle, but warm in West Africa. And
In
she
the
would,
winter as well.
yeah, it was super warm there. I mean, it's always, 80 plus degrees. Uh,
Wow.
yeah, it's lovely. Um, and so she would always go home, and whenever she went back to Ghana, she would, come into our bedroom and tiptoe at night and go under the bed and take a teddy bear or take some of her old school supplies. And
Mm.
whenever she visited, she would give that to kids in hospitals and schools and orphanages. So, when she passed away, we ended up going back to Ghana for her funeral and, all the burial ceremonies. And there were just so many people from the community there expressing their love for her and what she had done. And we realized that, while it was small for us, as a 6-year-old or sixth grade kid, her taking a teddy bear had such a big impact. And it had these ripple effects that went far beyond her. So that was like one of my biggest projects I did at, in sixth grade and beyond. It's an organization, a nonprofit called Hugs for Ghana, which we've been running for the last 15 years, 15 plus years, and now is operating in 6 different countries. And we do the same thing. We get teddy bears and school supplies and all these things and pick them up and hand deliver them to kids in developing countries. But that for me was one of my most fundamental parts of my childhood. When you ask me, what was it like as a child? I can't separate my growing up from, those long drives to school, that time at the library, and eventually the nonprofit made in honor of my grandmother.
And giving back.
Yeah, and giving back, exactly.
Yeah. I talked fairly recently on this podcast to someone who formed, her name was Wendy Steele. She formed an organization called Impact 100. And Impact 100 is really primarily an organization of women, although in Australia there are men who are part of it. But basically, what Wendy realized along the way was that, in fact, people are always looking for what can they do, and at the same time, they don't have a lot of time. So with Impact 100, she said, and the way the organization works, the only thing that she requires that anyone who joins the organization must do is donate a check for $1,000. That's it. If you don't want to do any work, that's great. If you want to be part of it and all that, it's fine. The organization is primarily composed of volunteers. I think they have now like 73 or 77 chapters in mostly in the United States, but they're also in Australia and a couple of other countries. Mm-hmm. And they have given out in the 20 years since the organization was formed, all told, close to $148 million. What they do is they take the money that comes in and they, for every $100,000 that a chapter raises, they give a $100,000 grant to someone. No administrative costs unless those are donated on top of the $1,000. So all the money goes back to the community. I think the first grant they ever gave was to a dental clinic to help with low-income people and so on. But it's a fascinating organization. As I said, it's called Impact 100. And she started it because as a child, she was very much involved in giving back. And for a while she didn't. And then it started again when her father passed away and she realized how many people from the community supported her and the rest of her family because they didn't have the tools or the resources to do it all alone. Yeah. And so I'm not surprised that you have the story of giving back and that you continue to do that, which is really pretty cool.
Well, I think I actually heard a statistic that I think they tried to track how early childhood development or just early adulthood affected later adulthood. And I think one of the findings was that people who volunteered when they were in middle and high school were significantly more likely to volunteer later in life than those who never did. And so there is a certain level of kind of, how you experience the world in your early ages and your early days affect your potential to want to make a change, especially as it relates to giving back or giving time or money or whatever effort, whatever it might be. I think it's a really interesting concept.
Well, it makes sort of perfect sense because as you're growing up and you're forming your life, if you see that you're doing things like giving back or being involved in supporting other people, and that is a very positive thing, it makes sense that you would want to continue that in some way.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it reminds me also of just like habits. You build your habits over time and it starts from super young ages. Not to say that you can't change habits. There's a bunch of research about the science of habit change and how to break a habit loop. And Charles Duhigg is a great author in that space. But it's also just really interesting just to think through that. But
and habits can be hard to break. Or they can be easy if you're really committed to doing it. But I know a lot of people say it's fairly challenging to change or break a habit.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Unfortunately, sometimes it's all too easy to make a habit. But anyway, there you go.
Yeah, it's funny because after, one of my habits I made when I was in high school that to my mom's chagrin was I used to always love just doing work on my bed. The positive thing about the habit was I was always comfortable. The negative thing is I would sometimes fall asleep. So there's so many times I'm mid-paper, mid take-home exam, fall asleep, have to wake up and scramble to finish. But I guess it made me a faster writer, if anything.
I remember when I was in graduate school at UC Irvine, I had an office of my own, and I was in it one day and I was looking at some material. Fortunately, I was able to get most of the physics texts in Braille. So I was studying one, and the next thing I knew, I woke up and my finger was on the page and I had just fallen asleep and my finger for reading Braille was right where I left off. Always thought that was funny.
Yeah, just a quick pause. Just a quick pause. You just paused for a
Yeah,
second,
yeah,
and then,
yeah, yeah. Even though it was about 45 minutes, but whatever. But my finger didn't move.
you're really focused, just on
That's
the
it. That's it.
letter.
The advantage of Braille.
Yeah, exactly.
But I do think that um, it's great to have those kinds of habits, and I really wish more people would learn the value of giving back and sharing, because it will come back to benefit you so many times over.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, well, it's even what influences me like now and even throughout, post high school. Like when I went into college, I knew I wanted to be in some sort of service and giving back type of industry, but I didn't really know what that was, right? Like I didn't want to do philanthropy full time because I found it difficult, right? Like I found it hard to have to go back to investors, and I found it difficult to sometimes sell the vision. Um, and my question was, is there a way to make this more sustainable? And so I spent a lot of my time in school and college just learning about social impact, which at the time was just coming up, like a lot of those impact investment funds, impact bonds, the idea that you can tie finance to impact and you can have carbon offsets that people buy and sell that has some sort of social good that you can somehow transact. All these kind of new and interesting ideas were coming around. Um, and it just got me interested, right? It's like, can I make a habit of creating an impact, but also have it somehow work within, this capitalist system that the world operates in? It's
Yeah.
something I've been wrestling with, even in all my future business and kind of current business work and practices.
What do you do when you propose an idea or have a thought and you discuss it with people and they object to it? How do you handle objections?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I'm always interested in the root cause, right? I think I'm one who tries to understand first before trying to persuade. So I could give you an example. I think very early in my very early in my college career, I realized that my parents wouldn't be able to pay for college for me. I was the youngest of three, and they'd used a lot of their savings on my siblings, both of whom ended up going to med school, which is very expensive,
Yes.
and to college, which was also very expensive. And being immigrants from Ghana, of course, they hadn't saved up an infinite amount of money. So my mom sat me down and told me, "Hey, you have to pay your own tuition." And so, you know, the person I had to convince to kind of help me here um, was actually, funny enough, restaurants are in Harvard Square. And the reason why is I decided to make a business that did restaurant consulting. So I
Oh,
went door to door and I would ask people and like, hey, do you need 20 Harvard students to come and help you understand how you can get more foot traffic in the door? Sell more pizzas or sell more burritos. I think I heard 20 or 30 no's. And finally one woman said, well, if you think that you can do it, then, show me the numbers, right? And that was really interesting. And so I think
yeah.
it realized, when she initially said no, I said, well, why not? She said, I just don't know if you can do it. And when I said, oh, well, we can actually show you the proof, she's like, okay, well then if you can run a pilot and show me the proof, then I'll do it. And so understanding the why, I think, is more important than getting the rejection and getting the setback. But that's how I try to deal with it.
One of the things that I learned fairly early on when I was put in a position of starting to sell for a living, um, actually in Cambridge, working for Kurzweil Computer Products and
Hmm.
taking a Dale Carnegie sales course,
Yeah.
um, was stay away from asking closed-ended or yes/no questions. And so most of the time, I wouldn't say, can we do this or would you do this? I would say, I'd like to hear your thoughts about, or um, we've got this idea. Tell me what you think. And doing other things to get people to talk. And when I started using that in my career, it was easy to get people to talk because they want to talk, or as I like to say, um, people love to teach. And most of the time, if you establish a relationship with people and they know you're listening, they're welcome or they're willing to give you wisdom. And so there are so many examples I have of asking open-ended questions like that. Or I went into a sales meeting with one of my employees, and there were a bunch of people there. And I said, tell me, to the first person I talked with, tell me why we're here.
Hmm.
And it totally caught him off guard. Of course, the other thing is that they didn't realize that the sales manager who was coming, that the guy who had set up the appointment, was told to bring his manager, and they didn't realize that the sales manager was blind, which also was a great addition to help. But again, I didn't ask, so you want a tape backup system, but rather tell me why we're here. Tell me what you're looking for. Why are you looking for that? What do you want it to be? And I actually realized by the time I went around the room that our product wasn't going to work, but we still did the PowerPoint presentation. And then I said, if in case you haven't figured it out, our system won't work. And here's why, but here's what will work. And that eventually led to a much larger order, as it turns out, because they called back later and they said, we got another project and we're not even putting it out for bid. Just tell us what we pay you and we'll order it. And it's all about, the objections are really mostly, I think, from people who maybe have some concerns that you didn't learn about because you didn't ask an open-ended enough or the right question, which is something that only comes with time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it also sounds very similar to like what journalists are trained to
Yeah.
do, like a great journalist. And I took a journalism class um, a few years ago, maybe 5 years ago, with Jill Abramson, who was one of the first female executive editors of the New York Times. And this was kind of her exact lesson, is that everyone has some story to teach, some wisdom to share, and the difficulty, or really the challenge on you as an interlocutor, as a journalist, as someone whose job it is to uncover the story, is to ask the right questions,
Yeah.
to allow that person the space to teach.
And if you don't know the right questions, you ask something open-ended enough that maybe you'll get to it.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And on the flip side, right? Because of course, you can't put all the burden on the person
No.
describing. You have to be an active listener. You have to listen,
Right.
and you have to know, and then you have to prod, and even say something like, "Tell me more." I
Yeah,
think that's
exactly
her
right.
favorite questions. Like, "Tell me more." Her second favorite question was, "And then what happened?"
Yeah.
Right? And those are two such simple things, and then what?
Yeah.
And it's just such an opening to really evolve and to grow.
And if they really think you're listening and that you want to know and understand, people will talk to you,
Exactly.
which is really what it's about. Well, so you did all of so you went to high school in Seattle,
Correct. Yeah.
and then what did you do?
Yeah, so high school in Seattle, graduated, went off to Boston for college where, of course, had to figure out a way to pay for school. And that was my first, I guess, for-profit business, was this restaurant consulting company. And of course, like I said, everything I wanted to do in my life was focused on social impact. So the impact there was that we only hired students to work for us who needed to pay tuition. There was this program called Federal Work Study where if you get
Yeah.
financial aid, you have to, work as part of a federal mandate for some amount of hours per week. And that was the work study requirement. And for the most part, students would do on-campus jobs that would pay $10, $15 an hour to do this work study. Well, I'd spun up this consulting business as a sophomore that I then ran for all 3 years. And on an hourly basis, we were making significantly more than that, right? So I was able to go find students who traditionally had been working their whole life, right? Harvard had such a, vast background of individuals. I knew people who were homeless, people who were billionaires, and everyone in between who ended up coming to the school. And so to find people who, had been working 40 hours a week since they were in middle school and give them a job where they could work less and actually have more free time to invest in their community or invest back into developing new skills was for me super impactful. On the surface, it was a restaurant consulting business, but behind the scenes, what we were doing with our staffing and with our culture was around that social impact. So I stayed out in Cambridge for 4 years, studied philosophy. I got a minor in computer science, and eventually went off to Microsoft back in Seattle, where I eventually then was a product manager and was a venture capital investor and met a bunch of really phenomenal and interesting people who were pushing technology forward.
Now, why Harvard, which is all the way across the country?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think I loved traveling. I loved, being out and about. And I think growing up as the youngest of three, and also as the child of African immigrants, they'd always told me, we moved here for you. Like we moved 3,000 miles away to a country where you don't speak the language, where you don't know anybody, for you. And what they meant for that is, we want you to really thrive. And even, now I'm at the age when my parents had first moved, right, to the US. And I can't imagine moving to a country where I don't know the language, don't know the people, and don't know a soul for my potential future children and their children.
Yeah.
But that's what they did. And they invested a lot of time, energy, and effort into me. And they always told me, we want you to be really successful. And so I remember um, when I was in middle school, my sister got into Harvard, which was unheard of, right? No one in our high school had gone to Harvard in the past, especially not for, a black family in a primarily white neighborhood. For one of us to go to Harvard was a big deal. And so I knew that, at the very least for my parents, for my sister, for my family, I wanted to kind of match up to that.
Well, and it certainly sounds like you've done a lot of that. Oh, here's an off the wall question. Having been around Cambridge and worked in Cambridge and all that, is Cheapo Records still in Harvard Square?
Oh man, you know what's so funny? I got a record player. I got a record player last semester, and I don't remember if Cheapo Records. That's the one that's like, I think I've, is that the one that's in like the actual like it's by like Kendall? It's like by Kendall Square.
No, I thought it was in Harvard Square.
Okay. I think it still exists. If I'm not mistaken, I think it still exists. I think I
Got a lot of records from Cheapo
there's only
over the
like
years.
5 record stores in Cambridge. And because I got a record player as a gift, I've been collecting a lot more.
Ah, yeah. I've gotten a lot of records from Cheapo and over the years, and of course, not so much now since I'm out here. But next time I get back to Mass, I'll have to go check.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, we can do a cheapo records hang. And what
We
I love
should.
about record stores is how tactile it is.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
There used to be one in New York that I would go to. They were more expensive, as New York tends to be Colony Records, and they're not there anymore, which is sort of sad. But
Yeah.
Cheapo, Cheapo just seemed to be one of those places that people liked. I don't want to say it was like a cult, although it sort of is. All the dedicated people to real vinyl. Um, but I hope it's still there.
It's a chain of record stores, or is it just that
No,
one?
I think it's a one.
Oh well. Yeah, I
If
think
there's more than one, I'm not aware of it.
I'd probably say I'm 80% certain it still exists. I'm
Well,
80%.
there.
Yeah.
So I have to come back to
For what it's
Mass,
worth.
and yeah, I'll have to go to Cheapo Records and Legal Seafood.
Oh yeah, legal seafood. That was yeah, I loved legal seafood. I used to go there all the time with my roommates from college, and yeah, we used to order the crab cakes and lobster rolls. It's a great time.
Yeah. And then their little chocolate desserts, which are great.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
the chowder. Oh, well,
Yeah.
yep. Gotta get back to Mass. Okay.
Now whoever's listening is probably getting hungry.
Well, as they should. The neat you know why they call it legal seafood.
I actually don't know.
Nothing is frozen. It's all fresh. It's legal.
Oh, I love that. I
Yeah.
love that. I realize that.
At least that's what I was told. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Well,
love
so you went to college, you went then back to Seattle and worked for Microsoft and so on. And so clearly you're also interested in the whole idea of investing and the whole life of being an entrepreneur in
Yeah.
various ways. And so you brought entrepreneurialism to everything that you did.
Yeah. 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 I mean, that was my first job at Microsoft. I was, managing what's called Windows IoT. So we were putting software on everything that wasn't a phone or a laptop. So think, smart screens in airports or
Mm,
screens in Times Square, or, the type of software that your Amazon Echo, maybe not Amazon in particular, but what that would run on. That was
yeah.
what I was working on, IoT, all these, they called it headless devices,
Yeah.
um, devices with no screens. And that was my team for a little bit. I worked there for about a year and a half. It was phenomenal. We were managing um, multiple billions of dollars in revenue, and there was only 40, 50 people on my team. So you do the math. We're all managing hundreds, tens to hundreds of millions of dollars
Yeah.
in our products. And while I loved it, I realized that my true passion was in meeting people, talking to people, and giving them the resources to succeed, versus giving them the actual technology itself. I loved being able to connect an engineer, with the right supplier to work on a hard problem that could then be built for Microsoft to eventually get to a customer. And that sort of connector role, is kind of the role of a venture capitalist,
Yeah.
right? You're connecting your limited partners who have invested in this fund to entrepreneurs who are trying to build some sort of idea from the ground up. And once you invest in the entrepreneur, you're then connecting the entrepreneur to mentors, to advisors, to potential employees, to potential customers. And so there's this value in being someone who's a listener, a journalist, right? Like we've been talking about, someone who has a habit of trying to make a broader impact. And it kind of all aligned with what I had been building up until that point. So I worked at M12, it's Microsoft's venture capital fund, and invested in a bunch of companies, from Kahoot, which is like an education startup, to um, obviously OpenAI was a Microsoft investment as well,
Yeah.
and other things like that. And so it was cool because the fund was really, we had the mandate of just find cool companies, and because we were Microsoft, we could reach out to any founder and have a conversation. So it really was a few years of just intense and deep learning and thoughtfulness that um, I wouldn't trade for anything.
What got you started in the whole arena of thinking about and then being involved with digital accessibility?
Yeah.
Because we've talked about that a lot, and I know that's a passion. So, how did you get started down that road?
Yeah, I mean, it came partially through, working at Microsoft, right? I mean, as I was at Microsoft, Satya Nadella, who was the CEO, he was making big, big investments into digital accessibility, primarily because his son, now his late son, had cerebral palsy. And a lot of the technology at Microsoft his son couldn't use. And so he had this kind of mission and vision to want to make more accessible technologies. But my first exposure to it, even before then, like I said, in college, I had to work all these jobs to pay tuition, and I built my own business. But one of the clients we consulted for um, was a large search engine. I'm sure you can imagine which one it was, and it wasn't Microsoft. And that search engine, I helped them devise their accessibility strategy.
You mean the
Uh,
G word?
Something like that.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. DuckDuckGo.
Yeah. Yeah.
No,
Duck, duck,
no.
go. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so it was really cool to work with them and to see like at scale, at 200,000 employee scale, at 1,000 product scale, how do you create systems and guardrails such that accessibility, in this case, digital accessibility, will be something that actually ends up happening. And so that was my first exposure to it. And then again at Microsoft, and then finally a third time while I was in business school, working on various projects with friends. And one friend told me, all I did at work this week was have to fix accessibility bugs because my company got sued. And that was like, and just all of those moments combined with the idea that I want to impact the deep empathy that comes through learning and knowing and understanding people's backgrounds and histories. All of it came to a head with what I now work on at TestParty.
So, now how long has TestParty been around? And we'll get to that. But how long have you had that?
Yeah, we started about a year ago.
Okay, so it's pretty recent. So yeah, definitely want to get to that. But um, so the whole issue of accessibility, of course, is a thing that most people don't tend to know a lot about. So let's start this way. Why should people worry about making products and places like websites accessible? And I know websites in a lot of ways are a lot easier than going off and making physical products accessible, especially if they're already out, because redesign is a very expensive thing to do and is not something that a lot of people are going to do. Whereas when you're dealing with websites, it's all
Yeah.
about coding and it's a lot easier.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think fundamentally it comes down to, you know, a set of core beliefs. And I think we could all agree, and I think we would all believe that like everyone has the right to a decent, fulfilling, and enjoyable life. I think regardless of where you fall on, belief spectrums or anything, that's something that we all fundamentally believe. You should live well. You should try to live a good life. It's what people talked about in writing for years. And I think when you think of the good life in today's terms, in the 21st century, it's almost inseparable from a life that also engages with technology,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's cell phones or computers or whatever it might be. Technology has become so fundamental into how we live that it now has also become part of how we live well and how we live a good life. And I'll give you a clear example, right? Let's suppose you really believe that voting is part of living the good life. There was a time 100 years ago, you didn't need to really have a car. You could get a horse and buggy. Maybe you could even walk to a voting station and cast your vote. In today's world, especially, let's just suppose a COVID world and even a post-COVID world,
Mm-hmm.
the computers, technology, websites are fundamental in living that good life. if that's your belief system, and you can play this game with any belief that you have, and once you extrapolate into what does it take for you to do that thing in the best way possible, it almost inevitably, engages with technology.
Yeah.
So, why do I think having accessible websites are important? Well, it's because pretty much 1 in every 5 people has a disability of some sort. And so to live the good life, they have to engage with technology. And if that technology is not working for them for whatever reason, then that needs to be fixed. That needs to be changed. And of course, there's the guardrails of laws, ADA, American with Disabilities Act, EAA, European Accessibility Act, and others that try to mandate this. And of course, there's the goodwill of companies who try to do this proactively. I think Apple is a really good example,
Yeah.
and Microsoft as well. But fundamentally, the question is, what is a good life? How do you enable people to live that? And I think through technology, people should be able to live a better life and should not have any barriers to access.
The thing is, though, take Apple, for example.
Mhm.
For the longest time, Apple wouldn't do anything about making their products accessible. Steve Jobs basically told people to pound sand when they said iTunes U wasn't even accessible, much less the iPod and the iPhone and the Mac.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it wasn't until two things happened that they changed, really. One was Target.com. Target had been sued because they wouldn't make their website accessible. And eventually, too many things went against Target in the courtroom where they finally said, okay, we'll settle and make this work. When
Yeah.
they settled, it cost them $8 million to settle. Whereas if they had just fixed it up front, the estimate is that it would have been about $40,000 in time and person hours. But because of where the lawsuit was filed and so on, it was $8 million to settle the case.
Yep.
And so that was one thing. And the other was, it had been made very clear that Apple was the next company on the target list because they weren't doing anything to make their products accessible. Well, Apple suddenly said, okay, we'll take care of it. We will deal with it. And I think they had already started, but and so as not to get sued, they said, we will do it. Well, probably the first thing that happened was the iPhone 3G. Well, maybe it wasn't the 3, it was earlier, but the iPhone became accessible. The iPod became accessible, pretty much all of them. iTunes U, the Mac. So by 2009, that's when I got my iPhone 3G, Apple was well known for making their products accessible. And they did it in a very clever way. It was accessible right from the outset. You didn't have to buy other stuff to make their products work. No need to buy a new screen reader or any of those kinds of things. So they spread the cost over every product that they sold, whoever bought it. So anyone who buys an iPhone can invoke accessibility today, which was cool.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think through Apple, I think the initial argument I made for why is it important to make websites accessible was an ethical argument, right? I think in Apple's case, they probably did the business case analysis and understood this actually does make economic sense. And I think what you see today is there's even more economic sense because of the expanding market size, right? Think the aging population that will develop some sort of disability or impairment, right? That's really growing larger, right? Think about, individuals who may have what people call temporary disabilities, right? That are not permanent, but last for some period of time, whether it's, 9 months, 10 months, 2 years, 3 years, and those types of things. So I think there's also a business case for it. I think that's what Apple as a case study has shown. What you bring up though is, does it matter? Does it really matter? Like why companies start doing this, right? And I think that's a question, to grapple with. If Apple did it out of the goodness of their heart versus because they didn't want to get sued, but the downstream effects are the same, does that matter? And I'm not going to be in question, do the ends justify the means? In this case, the ends are good, or at least justify the start, perhaps. But that's an interesting question. So, but I do think that they have done really good work.
Well, and you brought up something which we talked about, which is that you talked about one company that dealt with some of it because they got sued. And litigation is all around us. Unfortunately, we're a very litigious society. And in our world today, so like with Accessibility that I work with and work for that company, and a lot of what I do. Some people have said, well, Accessibility shouldn't always use the idea that, well, if you don't make your website accessible, you're going to get sued. That's a bad marketing decision.
Mm.
And I think there are limits, but the reality is that there are lawyers who are out there who still haven't been muzzled yet, who will file 50, 60, 100 complaints
Yeah.
just and they get a blind person to sign off and say, yeah, we support this because they'll get paid something for it. But they're not looking to make the companies deal with accessibility. They just want to earn money, $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 per company. But the reality is part of the market is educating people that litigation is a possibility because of the fact that the internet is a place of business under the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Yeah, exactly. And I think when you think of like, what is the purpose of litigation? Again, as a philosophy guy, I always think back to first principles. And it really is a deterrent, right? Obviously, no one wants to get sued, and of course, no one wants to pay damages, punitive or reparative. And so in this case, these are all examples of punitive damages that people are paying for not having done the right thing, right? In the best case, you do the right thing to begin with. But I think it's the consequence of not doing the right thing. I think, of course, there's the question of you described kind of these lawyers or what people call as kind of the trolls who are just kind of
Yeah.
going and suing and reaping the benefits from this. And I think it's an unfortunate side effect. I do wish that there was a world where these trolls wouldn't even need to exist because things
Yeah.
are working perfectly, right?
Well, and the reality is that it goes back far earlier than the internet. I mean, there are people who would drive around and make people in wheelchairs who might find the smallest violation wasn't even necessarily a legitimate violation, and they would sue and so on. So it isn't anything new that is just with the internet. It's been going on for years.
Yeah, those were the drive-by lawsuits. I remember I've heard about those, and I think this is the digital equivalent of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it is an issue, and it is something that needs to be dealt with. But you also talk about doing the right thing, and that's really the better reason for doing it.
Exactly.
Do you really want to exclude up to 20% of your potential business by not making your website accessible? Or better yet, if you make your website inclusive for all, what is going to happen when somebody comes to your website looking for a product and then they buy it because they were able to? Are they going to come back to that website, or are they going to go looking elsewhere? And there are so many studies, like Nielsen did studies and others have done studies that show absolutely people appreciate brand loyalty. And when they feel that they're valued and included, they're going to stick with that company.
Yeah, but even with that said, right, there's still this conflict of we all logically know it's the right thing to do. There's the business purpose for doing it, and yet people don't do it.
Yeah.
97% of the internet is still not accessible if you look at
It's
the
correct. Right.
page. And so our hypothesis, or at least what we take and what I take as a business, is that sometimes if it's too hard to do the right thing, people won't do the right thing. But that's what they want to do. And so how do you make it easier to do the right thing? And that's hopefully what we're hoping to change in the industry, is just making it easier. And also letting people know that this is an issue.
One of the criticisms. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, a lot of people don't do the right thing because just don't know that there is a right thing to do,
Right. Well, and one of the criticisms I've heard over the years, especially dealing with the products like Accessibility, is, well, the problem is you just slap this AI thing on their site. You're not teaching them anything, and that's not a good thing. And with manual coders, they're going to teach people. Well, that's not true either. But this whole argument of, well, you just put it on there and then you go away, which isn't true. But again, that's one of the criticisms that I've heard any number of times, and that you're not really educating people about accessibility. You're not really educating them much about it. And the answer is, look, the company that wants to do business came to you in the first place. So they obviously knew they had to do something.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think when I think through it, it's like, how do you make sure that the downstream effects of whatever you do is just positive and beneficial, right? And the ideal, as we all agree, I think, would be just to build it right the first time, whether it's physical buildings, build a building right the first time, or if it's websites, build the website correctly the first time. And whatever helps people to get to that stage and that level of thinking and habits, I think are ideal.
Coming from your background and so on, um, you know now that there are two basic ways that people can work to make websites accessible. One is the traditional way where you have someone who goes in and codes in the access and puts it right on the website. And now over the past several years, the other way that has come into existence is the whole concept of using, as Accessibility does, AI. And although AI won't necessarily do everything that needs to be done, it will do most of what needs to be done, and maybe everything, depending on how complex the website is. But what do you think about the whole fact that now AI has entered into the accessibility world and people are using it?
Yeah, I think AI is interesting, and I think AI is a tool. I think it's a tool that's been developed, obviously over a long history, right? Like the first artificial intelligent computers were in the 60s and 70s, being able to predict things, and of course, you heard of AlphaGo and computers that can play chess and all these different things. So I think we'll definitely be surprised by what AI can do as a tool. Um,
Right.
and the question is, will it be, the panacea, the thing to cure it all? While we all love for that to be the case, who knows? If it'll be AI, like maybe functionally AI could do that, but in terms of compute power, it won't be able to until we have quantum computing or something, right? In which case, maybe it'll leapfrog this whole type of technology, and maybe web pages will be obsolete in a decade, and then this whole idea of even needing to use AI to fix web pages will be replaced with something else, like Be My Eyes or something like that, that's even more advanced. But I think as I see it, it's a tool that can be used to make it easier. And whether it's ease of use in terms of physical effort, ease of cost in terms of bringing down costs to make a website compliant or a digital asset compliant, or just ease of understanding, right?
Yeah.
Someone can explain to you what these really complicated rules mean, and so you can actually think about it from day one. So I think AI as a tool can lead to ease, which can then furthermore lead to hopefully more accessible products.
Well, the first time I ran into real AI was working with Ray Kurzweil back in the late 70s. He developed a machine that would read print out loud to blind people. But one of the things that was unique about them, well, I don't know whether it's totally unique, but certainly was unique for blind people and for most of us, was the fact that the more the machine read, the better the reading got. It actually learned, and it learned how to understand and analyze its confidence, and so it would get better the more that it read. Of course, the only problem with that is back in those days, the software was on a cassette that went into a player that was part of a Data General Nova 2, and so it had to learn all over again every time you rebooted the machine and loaded the program. But that's okay. It learned based on what you were reading, but it really dramatically got better the more you read. And I think that today, the reality is that a lot of people really need to, and I would say this is true of manual coders, and I know a few who have adopted this. They'll use Accessibility to do what it can do, and then they in turn then go and address the issues that Accessibility's widget doesn't do. And for me, my learning that lesson actually goes back to the mid 1980s when I couldn't get a job and I started my own company selling computer-aided design systems to architects. And a lot of architects would come in and say, well, we can't buy your system. Yeah, it's great, it works. But if we use it, we'll develop our drawings in a fraction of the time, and we can't charge what we did because now we're not spending as much time. And I said, you're missing the whole point. You change your model. You're not charging for your time. You're charging for your expertise. You don't need to charge less. And what you do is then you go off and you get more projects, but you can also do more for each individual customer that you bring in. We had access to a system that was a one of the early PC-based three-dimensional solid modeling CAD systems. So people could come into our office, or anybody who bought the product could invite their customers in, and they could do actual walkthroughs and fly-throughs of buildings. They had light sources or windows to look out. You could even see what was going on outside. It wasn't renderings. You actually saw everything right on the computer. Those are so many things that revolutionized the industry. Now, of course, CAD is everywhere, as it should be. And the reality is that I think that any manual programmer who is programming a website could use Accessibility to do a lot of the work. And then and Accessibility also has some tools using a product called Access Flow, where they can analyze and even tell you exactly what you need to do with the things that aren't accessible. And then you can do it. But you can use Accessibility to do most of the stuff, and it continuously monitors. It's a scalability issue, and you don't get any scalability with manual coding at all. So again, it's the whole, as you point out, the whole tool of artificial intelligence really can make a big difference in what we're doing to create accessibility in the internet and in so many other ways as we go forward.
Yeah. And I know we're running right up on time with a minute or two left, but I think even fundamentally what you're describing back to first principles is if we make it easier, either in time or in effort or in understanding, to make things accessible, will people do it, right? Whether you're using an Accessibility or whether you're using another tool, there's
Right.
the question: how will it help, and will it help? And I think in evaluating any tool, and really I can apply in so many cases, that's the core question to ask.
Since we started late, it's up to you, but time-wise, we're fine. It's up to you. But I realize that we want to end fairly soon here, but I think you're right. And that gets back to the whole education issue. People really need to learn and understand the value of accessibility, why it's a good thing. And it's kind of hard to argue with losing 20% of your business because your website's not accessible, and the reputation that you gain by not doing it can go beyond that 20% when people tell their own friends about the issues they're facing.
Yeah, exactly.
But it goes the other way. You make it accessible and you get all sorts of accolades. That's going to help too. But it is a conversation that we need to have. And it's part of the whole big conversation about disabilities in general. We don't really see disabilities as much in the conversation. When we hear about people talking and discussing diversity, they talk about race, gender, sexual orientation, and so on, but they don't talk about disabilities. And disabilities tend to be left out of the conversation for the most part, which is extremely unfortunate. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think it comes down to I'm not sure why it is. I'm not sure, but I think even though I'm not sure why it is, I do know what I hope, and I think what I hope is for a world where every part of society reflects what it's made up of, right?
Yeah.
So you look at government, and it's representative of all the constituents: people with disabilities, people of different genders and races, and so on and so forth. So I think that's what I hope for. I think it's difficult, right? It's difficult based on the systems that have been made, people's biases, and more to get there. But I do think that's ultimately the hope. But
I think that a lot of it comes down to fear. People fear people with disabilities. I think that the whole fear factor, and even with race or gender or sexual orientation and so on, some of the comments, if you listen to them, all they're doing is promoting fear, which doesn't help at all. But in the case of disabilities, oh my gosh, I could become blind or paralyzed in a second. And that fear is something that we really don't tend to do nearly as much about as we should. And I know you and I earlier talked about fear. And the reality is that we can learn to control fear. I would never tell people, don't be afraid. No such thing as not being afraid, but you can certainly learn to control fear so that you can use it again as a very powerful tool to guide you and help you. And that's what the best aspects of fear are all about, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, speaking of fear, I would be afraid of what might go. I'm a president for Section G, which is one of the sections here at HBS, and we have to go select our class day speaker. So I would be afraid if I missed too much of the delivery.
Well, if they want to hire a speaker, I'm just saying.
I know, Michael. I was like, man, I wish I had met you like back when we were doing our like alumni and friend speakers.
On the other hand, we can certainly talk about next year And I would love to do that. Well, I want to really thank you for being here. I think we'll just have to have another discussion about all of this in the future, but I really appreciate you being here.
I know we're going to be connected a lot and chatting very, very frequently.
And you're going to go off and play drums later too, right?
Oh yeah, I'm in my, early retirement era,
Yeah,
before I
right.
go back into the workforce.
So, real quick though, you wrote a book. What's it called?
It's called Unlocking Unicorns. I'll send you a copy of the book, and so you can put in the show notes and everything else.
Yeah, that would be great. And if people want to reach out to you, how do they do that?
Yeah, but just my name, Michael Bervell, MichaelBervell.com.
There you
Contact
go.
page is there. My website is there. My bio, and this podcast will be there eventually as well.
It will, and you'll get all the info. Well, thanks very much. And I want to thank you all for listening. Really appreciate you listening to us today. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please email me at Michael, Michael. See, we spell our names the same. HI at accessibe, ACCESSIBE.com, or go to our podcast page, www.michaelhingson.com/podcast. Would love to hear your thoughts. Loved it if you would give us a 5-star review wherever you're listening. If you know anyone else who ought to be a guest, please introduce us. We're always looking for it. And I would also say if anybody needs a speaker, it is what I've been doing ever since September 11th, and I'm always looking for speaking opportunities. So please reach out and let's see if we can chat. And one of these days, maybe we'll get Michael to bring us up to Harvard. We can go visit the coop. But
yeah. Thanks so much for listening, everyone.
Thanks once more, Michael, for being here.
Appreciate it. Thanks. Bye.